Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Hey there, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Kristen Quiros-Bayona, and this is episode number 2 in a 3-part series that I've created to help those of you who've already launched a podcast to really optimize what you've created. Last week, I talked about ways that you can upgrade your podcast and reasons why you might be thinking about upgrading your podcast. So I talked about those of you who maybe threw your podcast together and then you realize that there are gaps and you don't know what you don't know. Then there might be those of you who started your podcast, but you pivoted your business and your services, you rebranded, and you're not feeling like your podcast is in alignment with your brand anymore. So those are some opportunities where you might want to think about ways to really optimize this powerful marketing tool that you've already invested your time and energy in. Even those of you who've started a podcast and it's working for you, you really enjoy it, you're consistent, you're putting out episodes, but you know that there's more. Maybe your downloads have plateaued, but you still have a certain level of listeners every week, and you're kind of wanting to just get to that next level of growth and see your downloads increase a lot faster, bring in some aligned sponsorships. If you're in that boat, this episode is going to be really helpful for you because after you do some of the upgrades that I talked about in last week's episode, then it's a really great time to think about how to organically grow your podcast. And so this discussion is not going to be focused on growing your podcast with ads, because really in the podcasting space, the best way to grow your podcast is through word of mouth. So 60% of podcast growth is due to word of mouth. And so you really want to focus on getting your podcast in front of the right people in the right places and be strategic about where you promote your show. And that high percentage of growth due to word of mouth really emphasizes the organic growth part of this episode around how to grow your podcast. Because in the podcasting landscape, it's not so much about how much money you have to throw at a podcast. It's really about the content, the connection that you're making with your audience. So that's why it makes it that much more important to really know your audience, to really think about who is really starved for content, who needs to hear your message, and hone in on that, and then create the episodes that they want to hear. That's going to go a lot further than, say, putting a ton of money into ads or investing a lot in social media and advertising that way. So social media should be a part of your promotional strategy, but it should just be one element. But I'm going to share with you a few other ways that are going to be more impactful in terms of growing your podcast. Now, I have 4 really strong ways that you can organically grow your podcast. I'm going to talk about 2 of them today, but I do have an upcoming program for those of you who have a podcast and you want to maximize this really powerful tool that you have and grow your audience and your business, that I'll be talking about in the last episode of this 3-part series. And the 4 ways that are really effective for growing your podcast are all driven by the same philosophy, which is you want to be connecting with people who already listen to podcasts. Okay, I'll say that again. You want to be connecting with people who already listen to podcasts. Why? Because it's much harder to get someone interested in listening to your podcast who doesn't listen to podcasts, has never listened to a podcast, maybe doesn't even know what a podcast is. And there are people out there who still do not know what podcasts are. And so to get them on board to listening to your podcast or even a podcast, that's going to be a lot further of a journey that you're going to have to take them on, as opposed to people who are already passionate podcast listeners, people who listen to 6 to 7 shows a week, and they absolutely have their favorites. They love listening to podcasts. It's part of their routines. They love learning by listening to podcasts. So you want to focus your efforts on reaching those people. Like I said before, there's 4 really great ways to do that. But for now, I'm going to just talk about the 2 most effective ways that you can grow your podcast organically and where you should be spending most of your time. Okay, the first way is by being a podcast guest. So getting on podcasts that have similar audiences to yours, being able to share your knowledge for 45 minutes to an hour gives these listeners who are already aligned, right? They're already within your target audience, gives them such an opportunity to get to know you. They get so much time with you. They're going to listen to this episode because they are already a listener of whatever podcast you're on. So they get that meaningful, in-depth time to learn about you and to get a sense of your vibe and your knowledge, which is really powerful. And you get built-in trust, which is the most powerful part of being on a guest on someone else's podcast. You're being interviewed by someone who they already trust. And for them, that's a fun experience. I love listening to the host of a show that I really like interview anyone, just because I'm already bought into this person's podcast, their personality. And so anyone they bring on is pretty much an enjoyable experience because I get to experience them through this host who is interviewing them. So it's so powerful to get that automatic trust factor. And that's something that is so important when we are cultivating an audience, when we're cultivating clients, potential clients. So that's why being a guest on podcast is so important. And it's how you should really be investing your time. If you only do one thing, I would recommend that you pitch yourself to aligned podcasts and, reach for the stars a little bit, reach beyond, say your podcast has 10,000 downloads a month and you see someone that has maybe a bigger audience than you do, reach out. You never know. And you could be a guest and get in front of a lot more people. So that's where I would recommend spending a good chunk of your time to get the most return on your investment. Okay, number 2, getting featured on podcast apps. Okay, so if you don't know, you can pitch yourself to apps like Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and they will promote your podcast inside their app. And this is really great because, again, going back to that strategy of being promoted to people who already listen to podcasts, when you're featured inside an app that has millions of subscribers or listeners through their app, it's going to put you in front of these avid podcast listeners who are looking for new, juicy podcasts to listen to. So this is kind of like being featured in Apple in their new and noteworthy section when you first put out your podcast. Different apps have different ways to highlight podcasts. They don't always have to be new. In fact, if you have something that is newsworthy or timely, those are ways that you can also get featured in these podcast apps. So one thing to think about is what is relevant on your podcast that might position you to get highlighted. So do you have a podcast that is specifically focused towards women? Is it Women's History Month? Or do you have a podcast that is specifically targeted towards the Latinx community? If it's Hispanic Heritage Month, that would be a great time to pitch it. Or do you have a really high profile guest on your show that you would like to highlight? Or is your show starting a new season? Those are all things that are noteworthy that could get the attention of these apps. So just thinking strategically about the value of pitching your podcast to these apps, think about why would they want to feature you? And just ask yourself, why now? Like, what is unique about my show? And connect those dots for the app. The application process is pretty straightforward. And another thing to think about as well is by being featured on these apps, it's a great feather in your cap. So when you go to reach out to advertisers or sponsors, you have a really cool thing that you can highlight and say, hey, I was handpicked by Apple for whatever they highlighted you for. And that's something you can use across your marketing content as well, on your website. And so some people might think that, oh, my podcast has been out for a while and I haven't pitched it anywhere, or, I missed that opportunity of it being a new podcast. And actually, it's not always necessarily a good thing to promote your podcast right out of the gate, because if you're anything like me, I knew that my podcast was only going to get better and better. And I knew that I needed that time to hone my skills, and that the show was going to just get better the more experience I had under my belt. So I actually didn't do a lot of promotion of my second podcast because it was a new format, it was a new style for me, and I knew I just kind of needed that space, and that I would have opportunities later to promote my show when it felt right, when I felt like I was ready. And so most shows, they do take time to develop and to hit their stride. And the longer you are podcasting, the better your show is going to get. So it could actually be better to get all those kinks out, to hone your voice, and to maybe get bigger guests before you pitch to these apps. All that to say, if you haven't promoted your show using either of these methods, it's not a big deal, and your podcast is going to be here for a while. So it's all about evolving. It's all about timing and thinking about, okay, where am I now? And what can I do today to promote my podcast to the right people? Okay, so those are my two top ways to grow your podcast organically. Like I said before, there are two other ways that are really juicy, great ways to promote your podcast as well. I will be sharing more about that inside of my newest offer to help those of you who have podcasts to really optimize what you have and grow your audience full of aligned listeners, and just grow this fantastic tool that you've created, that you've invested time in, that represents you and your brand. And I'll be sharing more about that in the next episode. And I also want to remind you that this podcast is going on break for the summer, and the last episode will be at the end of this month. But if you've missed any of the previous shows, you have all summer long to go back and listen to them, or to binge season 1, season 2. Just know that the show will be back in September with some really fantastic guests. I've actually already booked half my guests. So that's all I've got for you this week. I'm so excited to share the next episode with you, the last episode in this 3-part series, and it will be all about pitching your podcast. So we've talked about ways to upgrade your podcast. Today, I talked about ways to organically grow your podcast. And in order to implement these 2 strategies, you will have to pitch. So that's what next week's episode is going to be about. I'm going to give you some tips for pitching your podcast. Thank you again for listening to this episode and to listening to this series. If you enjoyed this episode, like I mentioned at the top of the show, the best way to grow this podcast is via word of mouth. So if you know of any badass female entrepreneurs who have a podcast and want to learn more about how to grow that podcast, go ahead and share this episode with them. I would be so grateful. And I am grateful for you for listening to this show. Thank you again. And I will see you inside the next episode. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss a show. And rating and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help support us. Always remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.